Hi everybody, welcome to our discussion of magazines, chapter 5 in our book. And I know over the course of your life you've enjoyed reading many magazines, different kinds. So this chapter talks about the development and evolution of magazines from a very early point in time in the 17th century until present day. So I hope you enjoy. Magazines have actually been around in one form or another since about the 17th century. They started in Europe and spread to other parts of the world. We'll talk more about that in a second. But one of the things that's happened that has really affected magazine sales the most in the last 10 years or so has been the recession that America has been under and other parts of the world too. In other words, as our economy has had difficulties, advertising companies have had fewer and fewer dollars to spend to promote their products and services and goods in magazines as it is in many types of the media right now. Same sort of financial crisis is affecting newspapers and television station ads and things like that. And magazines have been also hardest hit. There is a feeling in general that if the economy turns around, continues to turn around, that magazines will probably get more popular again. But one of the things they have to do in addition to getting more revenue from advertising is retaining younger readers because information has shown that surveys have shown that some younger people do not read magazines just as they don't always read newspapers. So retaining younger readers is one key to making popularity magazines rise. And the other thing that's key is that printed magazines are now going cross-platform, and many of them have been doing this for a decade or two. But for example, in this National Geographic magazine that's on the screen there, the one on the left is a printed copy of a Geographic. It happens to be in another language, but that's okay. And then what you see to the right of that printed copy of the issue is versions of the cover that appear on various tablets and cell phones and Kindles and things like that. So increasingly, advertising has played a role in saving magazines. Also, new forms of digital platforms are playing a role in bringing in younger readers and more non-traditional readers to a magazine. People who are willing to pay a subscription, probably for a little bit less than they would for a print magazine, in order to have the convenience factor there. And of course, for all you environmentalists out there, this saves paper, it saves ink, it saves a lot of other costs that go on along with traditional magazine publication. Like I said, some of the earliest magazines, it would take us weeks and months of discussion to go through all of them, but magazines before they were really popular were preceded by brochures, pamphlets, almanacs. You've probably heard of Poor Richard's Almanac. You've heard of various kinds of brochures that are published. But the need was finally to provide a version of newsworthy and entertaining information on a more regular publication schedule, and in some cases to appeal to specific reader interests. So the first magazine, most scholars have identified as a publication called Edifying Monthly Discussions. That's not the original title of that's not the title of the magazine because it's printed in German, which is where it originated, by a man named Johann Ries, who operated the magazine from 1663 to about 1668, a 5-year period. Much of the content was written by Ries himself, but occasionally there was other kind of content. And it was scholarly kind of discussions about issues of the day, and it came out more or less on a regular schedule. In a short period of time, in the 17th century, other magazines followed in countries like France, Italy, England, and some of the other major European cities. One of the things that early magazines were responsible for were, just as newspapers had become more popular and cheaper, magazines also improved the literacy rate, particularly in the 18th century, particularly among women. By that I mean is if there was fairly reasonably priced literature that people could read from the form of magazines, just as they read in newspapers or books, people tended to become more literate. They tended to learn how to read more the population did, so they could take advantage of reading this stuff. So their literacy rates, in other words, the rate at which people can read, started to rise in the 18th century. Many of the early magazines emphasized literature, culture, living. They were fairly high-minded. And then along with the Industrial Revolution, when we started to get more things like the steam printing press and more the ability to move products all over the country by railroad at cheaper prices for manufacturing items, the first successful mass circulation American magazines come along. And the longest or first successful mass circulation American magazine was Saturday Evening Post, which started being published in 1821, went out of business for a couple of years at the end of the 1960s, and then has been published since 1971. This is probably the magazine that you've probably seen because it's familiar. One of the first magazines to use artwork on every cover. In many cases, paintings done by American artists like Norman Rockwell. And they started to use stories by people who were either already popular writers or would become popular writers in later decades. So Saturday Evening Post has been around in America for the longest, and I should say they've been the most successful. By the way, at the top right copy of the slide here, there's a small print of the Edifying Monthly Discussions magazine there, and of course it's written in German. And this was published for about a 5-year period, as I said. So magazines haven't always been popular. They haven't always been available. In the 1800s, magazines cost about 25 to 35 cents each, which was a pretty hefty sum that prevented some people from buying them. And then in the late 19th century, there started to be a system of magazines that competed against each other. McClure's magazine dropped their price to 15 cents an issue in 1893. And then Cosmopolitan, which has also been around since the 19th century, originally had their price at about 15 cents an issue. They went to 12.5 cents and then 10 cents an issue. Muncie magazine, which was a very popular magazine at the time, went to 10 cents an issue also. So because the price dropped, more people started buying. And that caused the magazines to greatly increase circulation. The magazines would print more copies if more people were willing to buy it. And that in itself led it to become cheaper to produce. If you're already set up to run, 10,000 copies of a magazine, and suddenly you're running 30 or 40,000 copies of a magazine, it incrementally does not cost you that much more to print a larger number of issues. So advertising revenue also went up because with more frequent issues, more high-end content. When advertising revenue was popular, when advertisers were anxious to get their message into magazines, profits also soared. So this combination of lowering the price, increasing the circulation, and then increasing the advertising revenue was a very successful formula for decades. And I've got examples here on the screen of various magazines. There's a October 1899 issue of Cosmopolitan, which was what it was called before. It was just called Cosmopolitan. And you can see that Mark Twain has a article in there about Christian Science. It was one of the topics that he wrote about in his books. And so we're getting some famous authors involved in magazine publications. So in the beginning, editorial content was most important to magazines. And by editorial content, I mean everything that wasn't an ad. It didn't necessarily mean that opinion pieces is what I'm talking about. It could be any kind of content. It could be fiction, nonfiction, poetry, just informational articles, feature stories. That was what was important. But because advertising was needed to help support the magazines, by about 1900, advertising really became crucial to the success of magazines. And at some point, magazines started having a lot of advertising content, 30, 40, 50% or more of an issue. And some magazines to this day have more advertising than content if you count pages and space. And that is why some magazines are still able to survive at a time when, over the last 200 years, many, many magazines have come and gone. This is just some examples of advertising. And we're all familiar with seeing full-page ads in various kinds of magazines. And that's what pays the bills. You buying a magazine off of a rack at a bookstore isn't really much revenue to the publisher. It's literally a few cents of profit for them. What really is profitable is the advertising that comes in and helps with production costs and hiring the staff and meeting payroll and things like that. Magazines are in racks primarily for the enjoyment of people that want to cruise through a bookstore or some other place and pick up an occasional copy. Most people now find their subscription rates online and get a slightly better price. So with the 20th century, we started seeing a lot more diverse content. And the first one I want to touch on is news magazines, focusing on national and world news. Many of these magazines that you've heard of probably go back further than you might imagine. Forbes magazine started in 1917, which was right at the end of World War I. Time magazine, which is still in business, came about in 1923. Business Week, just a few years after that, and then Newsweek, just a few years after that. And these news magazines were a part of an effort to try to make sense of the world for the public. They could read their daily newspaper, and when radio came along, of course, they could get information news off of radio, and later on they could do that with TV, and later on with the internet and other forms of information gathering. But for many people, and these are recent issues, they're not necessarily old-time issues. For many people, this was a way for them not just to get financial or business news, but also to find out a recap of the most important stories going on in the world. So I picked a Forbes cover here, which shows that they have a Forbes 400 or a Forbes 500 almost every year or two. And this shows Oprah standing in front of two other people on the billionaires list. There's a Time magazine cover there on Kim Jong-un, I believe. And then Business Week on this particular issue focused on Google. And then this Newsweek issue on the bottom right is their cover for when Donald Trump won the presidency. Another thing that was really important in the development of magazines was picture magazines, telling human interest stories through photojournalism essays. Life and Look were the two most popular. Life started in 1936 and folded in 1972. Look magazine started in 1937 and folded in 1971. So they basically were being published about the same time frame. And this Life cover is one of Marilyn Monroe from back in 1952. And this Look cover, I'm pretty sure it was from the early 1960s, because that's President John Kennedy, his wife Jacqueline Kennedy, and their youngest daughter. And I think that that's John Kennedy Jr. there. She's holding the infant. So these focused on really long-term photo essays. It might be a big chunk of the magazine might be devoted to the latest Hollywood starlet like Marilyn Monroe or the new presidential family. A lot of very important photojournalists over the years, like W. Gene Smith, published extended page essays in these magazines and brought photography and journalistic photography into the 20th century. And these covers and these magazines are very, very interesting to look at. They show an in-depth look of the way the world was at the time. And most of you probably most of you weren't alive by the time these two magazines folded. Like I said, there were some others, Focus, Peak, Photo, Pick, Click. But these kind of picture magazines kind of fell out of the mainstream because audiences started wanting what were called niche magazines. In other words, magazines that appeal to a hobbyist or somebody interested in a particular topic. And now if you want to learn more about pig farming, you can probably check the internet and find 5 or 6 different magazines devoted just to pig farming. Or if you're interested in botany, you can find a dozen or more magazines that write about botany issues. So what we see here with these picture magazines was a broader look at the world and about the America that the people lived in, and kind of fading away as people got more into specific types of magazines that they wanted to read. So one of the other types of things that happened was in the 19th, 20th centuries was that literary magazines came into being, short stories, serializations, and there's just a handful of authors there that published some of their original work in magazines, and later on it was compiled into book form. Edgar Allan Poe, I'm sure you're familiar with his horror tales. Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, the poet. Ernest Hemingway had a number of his original articles that appeared serialized in magazines. And by serialized, I mean maybe they broke the article up into 3 chunks, and you could, over a 3-month period, read the complete story. Some other books that got their starts in magazines were Uncle Tom's Cabin, Hiroshima, Moby Dick, Walden, Tarzan of the Apes, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. To the right of the screen there is the article about Hiroshima by John Hersey, which the New Yorker magazine, excuse me, I got a drink of water there. The New Yorker magazine devoted an entire issue to just publishing this book by John Hersey about Hiroshima, and they did it before the book actually came out, I think. So it was very popular for higher-end magazines to publish established authors as well as newer people that later would become established authors and let their work get well known to the public. But as you might imagine, this in itself is a little bit of a niche market because not everybody would be interested in reading this kind of thing. Another diverse content thing is pulp magazines, and you probably heard of or watched the movie Pulp Fiction. It kind of is, that movie itself is in the same genre as the pulp magazines that inspired it. Pulp magazines started in the late 1800s, and some of them still exist, but many of them were established well into the 1950s and 60s. Most of them have died out, but basically we're talking about fiction, what I would call garish fiction, in other words, way over the top storytelling. And there's some examples of some of the magazines that were out over the years: Startling Stories, Weird Tales, Detective Weekly, and Detective Comics. Now these involved also very, very fantastic themes. Life with aliens, science fiction was really a popular one. In the 1930s, especially, when police work and the FBI were going on, detective magazines were really popular. Detective Comics, which I show an issue there with the Joker and Batman, was when the kind of the first superhero comics were launched. And this is not a particularly early issue, but it does show you that there was a transition from pulp magazines, which were kind of cheap, kind of the same as what we call in books the dime novels, the westerns of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were very, very inexpensive, 15 or 10 cents a piece, and they launched a lot of careers of science fiction writers and superheroes. They became especially controversial in the 1930s and 40s because of the lurid content Many of the themes of these things involved really violent crime, mistreatment of women, women as sex objects, and there was some kickback from the reading public to the publishers of these types of magazines to not take the themes too far afield, and that led to a little bit of reeling back in. But you can still find some of these pulp magazines if you want to look hard enough on the internet. So that's it for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2. We'll have more about magazines coming up really soon. Thank you very much.